Hey crew, Coach Josh here with GarageGangGyms.com, and today we're going to talk about setting up your cutting board so that it's a lot less maintenance and it's a lot easier to dry, to clean, to get the gunk off of it so that food prep can be as fast as possible. So one of three things is what you're going to need. You're going to need either a mineral oil. Now, this is a food grade mineral oil that I got in the pharmacy section. Actually, it's a laxative. The reason I recommend you get it in a pharmacy is because it's only $6. If you were to get this in, say, a cutting board aisle, it's going to be the same mineral oil, but they're going to charge you $20 because it's a cutting board oil. It's the same thing. So a mineral oil. You could also use a coconut oil. Not a huge fan of using coconut oil because it can putrefy and it can actually decay, right? So you don't want it rotting, smelling, things like that. But this is one alternative if maybe you don't have mineral oil or you don't want to go get it. You could also use a beeswax. So this board wax that I got, it's actually from knifeware.com. This board wax is a combination of beeswax, which is going to help seal the grains of this wood, and also mineral oil, which is going to help repel water. Now, this is actually the wax that came with this cutting board. I love this cutting board, hate their wax. Why? Linseed oil. Just like with the coconut oil, it can actually putrefy. Not a huge fan of that. This would be great if I had wood furniture that I wanted to kind of make shine, but certainly not going to be using this on my cutting board. And I'll actually be reaching out to the makers of this cutting board and let them know why I'm not using this. So if you want to use a mineral oil, all you have to do, and I'll use a different cutting board, is just get a few drops on your board. It's really simple. Just a few drops at first. And then I like to use a paper towel. You could use gloves. You could use your fingers. And then we're just going to rub this in. A lot goes a long way. And we're going to work it into the grains of the wood, right? So you can see how quite a bit of it is wet with the mineral oil. Quite a bit of it is dry. And you'd go through the entire board. You'd want to get into the cracks. You'd want to get onto the sides as much as you can. If you're using a mineral oil, just like with the wax that I'll be describing in a little bit, once you get this mineral oil worked in as well as you want, and again, do all of the sides, even the sides you don't use, because again, our goal with mineral oil is to help repel water. It's also going to help a little bit with repelling the juices of maybe your vegetables or your meat. You want to leave that out overnight so that it can dry, and then you'll go through the same buffing process that we'll talk about with this cutting board. But I'm going to use this wax. So this wax, all I'm going to do is just take a little bit of chunk, and I'm just going to rub it on there. I like to use my fingers because it actually ends up being kind of a nice hand moisturizer. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be pretty. We're just trying to get this to work into the grooves, work into the cracks of this wood. And as I'm going, so let's get that a little bit better, it'll actually add quite a bit of a shine to my board. So this is dry over here, and then this is the shiny part. Now, just like I mentioned with the mineral oil, we're going to be leaving these overnight. That way, they'll get nice and dry. The wood will actually absorb the wax or the mineral oil a lot better. And then we'll actually buff it out. So unfortunately, you won't be able to use your cutting board for a day, but most often what you're going to do is you're going to finish prepping your food, let's say. You're going to quickly wash your board. You're going to quickly get it dry. Maybe let it sit out for 20, 30 minutes before you start adding in the wax. If you want to leave it overnight to dry and then put the wax on, that works great. So while I'm waxing my wood, let's talk about some things, some do's and don'ts about your cutting board. So do wash your cutting board after every use. Do not throw it in the dishwasher. Do not soak your board in water, right? Some people, what they'll do is with their cutting boards, they'll throw it into the sink after, let's say, doing dishes. The problem with that, if you're just going to let it soak in there, is wood absorbs moisture, right? Even with the wax, it's going to absorb a little bit. And with that moisture comes bacteria, right? You're basically giving the water to that bacteria that you're hoping not to grow on your wood, and you're just going to let that happen. And then worse yet, your wood, again, will absorb that water. It's going to start to kind of bulge, and it's going to have wet spots. And again, you don't want your wood to rot because, again, then you have to deal with that in your food. So again, we wax it to keep some of the water out, but we also have a good habit of not soaking our boards. Now, what do you use to clean your board? Just like my knives, I just use a sponge. I just use a sponge with a little bit of water. As soon as I'm done cleaning it, I get it dry as quickly as I can. Work into these letters. Yeah, the company that I went with, they etched in these letters. So it says Garage Gang Gyms LLC in it, which is kind of cool. But again, so that's a do and a don't. Another don't is vinegar. So the reason I wouldn't use vinegar is, vinegar can be acidic. Well, acid over time can really etch into things, especially like wood. Even if you're using a hardwood, a softwood, whatever you're doing, that vinegar, if you use it all the time, especially if you're soaking your wood in it, that's going to open up pits. It's going to open up pores. And again, we don't want to do that. We want to keep our board as pristine as possible. Using the proper knives too. If you use a really nice sharp knife, you're going to, especially with an end grain wood like this, end grain you can tell because it's the sides of the grain itself, where this one was more one straight sheet. This was probably stamped out of a piece of plywood, where this was one piece at a time individually put together. Anyway, the end grain style, as you're cutting into it, as you're kniving it, the blade actually goes into and around the grains. And this type of wood too does actually, it's called self-heal. It expands just a little bit. And that's why instead of going with a maple like most people would, I went with a walnut. And this is a walnut. Maple is going to be a little bit harder. Walnut is going to be a little softer, but it's also going to do what's called self-heal. Which again, if I get a knife wound in this thing real bad, it'll at least kind of sort of work its way out, and it'll make the board last a lot longer. So again, you want to use a nice knife so that you're not cutting huge holes into your board. You also don't want to just aggressively chop on a board like this. It's not made for a meat cleaver. If you're using a meat cleaver, get something else. Get a board that you don't necessarily care about. Yeah, I really got that foot real good. And again, we're just working it in there as much as we can. This thing is really starting to shine. It's really, really getting pretty. When I buff it tomorrow, because I'll let this sit overnight, when I buff it for you guys tomorrow, it's really going to shine for you guys. And my wife won't think I'm so crazy that I got a nice cutting board, because it'll look pretty. Okay, some other don'ts when it comes to your cutting board. So again, we talked, we're not soaking it in vinegar, we're using a proper knife. Certainly not going to throw it into the dishwasher. Heat. Heat is a big one. We don't put these outside and just let them sit. We also, that's the reason we don't put them in the dishwasher, is because that heat, it really makes this wood expand. And again, if we're expanding this wood, especially an end grain like this, there's a chance that the seams between the chunks of wood could actually start to separate. The glue could start to kind of come off and delaminate, which is definitely something we don't want. So again, when we're cleaning our boards as well, we're only going to use a mild soapy water. Again, use a sponge. You don't have to use a Brillo pad, because you got to think a Brillo pad, it's scratchy, which again, in some cases, like a cast iron pan, that can be good. But when we're talking something that's going to harbor food or harbor bacteria like a cutting board, now you're just inviting that bacteria to grow, and that's not ideal. So again, a Brillo pad, not a great idea. Let's get this slimy thing flipped over. Gonna give it a quick run through again, real quick. Yeah. And again, we're gonna leave this overnight. So flash to tomorrow. So it's the next day, we let our boards dry overnight. Now we have to buff out the extra wax or the extra oil that's still on there. That way we can start using them. So I'm just using a paper towel. If you want to use a cotton towel, you certainly can. I do not recommend you guys using a rag, because a rag is going to be kind of abrasive and it's going to scratch up the surface. So let's just get to buffing. So I'm just doing small circles, trying to just get the excess off. This is going to take a little bit of time. So now, Josh, we're spending the time waxing, we're spending the time using mineral oil. How often should we be doing this? Well, it really comes down to how often you're using your board. So us here, we're going to do our boards about once a month, maybe once every 6 weeks, because we use our board maybe 4 or 5 times a week because we're doing quite a bit of prep in one go. If you're using it every night, you may want to think every 3 weeks, maybe every 4 weeks. If you're using mineral oil, you're going to have to do it a little more regularly because it doesn't penetrate and hold as well as the wax. And again, therefore, it's not going to seal out your wood as well. But if that's all you're using, that's totally fine. And once we've finished buffing out these cutting boards, we want to make sure that we wash them. And we'll talk about some of the things that we'll do there. So make sure we're getting all of the excess. So the wax, again, it really wants to stick to this surface, which is great. It's going to keep this cutting board nice. And I can see the luster coming out of this thing. Coming this way. And again, they may still be a little sticky when we're done here, but that's why we're going to wash it quickly. But I'm doing my best to get all of the nooks and crannies, as you should too. And again, it only takes a few minutes, right? A few minutes one day, you let it dry, a few minutes the next day, and it's going to keep your cutting board nice for a very long time. That way, if you decide you want to get a nicer cutting board, maybe you want to get kind of an end grain board like this one, your investment will last long term. So I did the bottom of my cutting board, so I'll flip that over and do this as well. Yeah. And again, the luster on this thing is crazy, incredible. And this also kind of helps work in some wax into the grain a little bit. Maybe it didn't fully penetrate, so we're again giving it one last shot to absorb what it can. Then we're going to wash them. We're going to dry it. And once it's dry, feel free to use it as much as you want. Again, I may let this board dry overnight just to make absolute sure I like what the wax is doing. Maybe I'll have to buff it again in the morning. Chances are I won't because I'm doing a pretty good job right now. And there you have it. We got most of the wax off. Now it's time to take a sponge to this thing. Okay, so cleaning this thing, just going to get my sponge wet here. And I'm just going to put a little drop, if I can, with this big old jug. Just a little drop, because we don't need a ton of soap. Well, more than a drop, I see. And I'm just going to use kind of lukewarm water. If it's too hot, you can actually damage the wood over time. But we're just lightly buffing again, just to get it nice and sudsy. Then we'll do a good job of rinsing this thing off. And I'll do all of the sides because I waxed all of the sides as I recommended you guys do. Just try not to make too much of a mess. My wife really loves it when I make a mess. Nice. And again, after this, we'll just let it dry. Towel drying this, it gets it so that you could use it right away. And again, I'm not soaking the wood. I'm just getting it wet enough. I'm not having the water run the whole time. Just because wood absorbs water, even with that wax that we just put on, or even the mineral oil. So again, we're only getting it as wet as we have to get it clean. Now again, we just made it so much easier for us to clean these things because of the fact that we sealed them off. Now, you're probably wondering, Josh, how long are you going to keep the feet, these things right here, right, on your cutting board? And I don't know. I have a tendency to use like a shelf liner anyway underneath these cutting boards. And if I can figure out a way to safely seal the holes that these screws made, I may take these off, just because right around where the screw is, there is a chance for it to kind of hold a lot of bacteria, hold a lot of gunk. And I'll see over the use of this cutting board what I think. If I don't like how much gunk sticks in those screws or in those holes, I'll make sure I take those off. So again, we just got it a little wet. We'll get our towel out. And again, I'm just halfway rubbing this down just to get as much of the main standing water off as I can. Some has absorbed into the wood, but that's why we're going to let it dry. Again, if you want, you can go right into using this cutting board. Right now, my daughter's actually sleeping, so I'm not really prepping food right now. I'll prep food later. It's kind of in the middle of the day. So we'll get it all nice and good. Try to get the letters. Yes, again, this maintenance takes a little bit of time, but boy, does it keep your cutting boards nice so that you only have to choke on the price once. You only have to buy them once, hopefully. And then I'm just going to go put this somewhere where I know it'll dry. So there you have it, guys. That's how you wax your wood at home. Again, keep in mind, based on how much you actually use your board, that's how often you're going to wax it or oil it. Every 4 to 6 weeks, you should be okay unless you have some really heavy use. Again, with mineral oil, you may want to wax your wood just a little bit more. This was Coach Josh from GarageGangGyms.com. I'll see you next time.